Alright YouTube, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. Today guys, we're gonna talk about tier list, and to thank my subscribers for actually helping out in doing this tier list, especially Hono for giving his insight with regards to the tier list. Thank you so much. But yes, here is our tier list for the post selection pack Outlaws from the Inferno. So we have the Tenpai, we have Goblin Biker supports, and Ritual Beast, and also Infernoid supports, which was kind of cool though. So first and foremost, we have here Branded Despia. Now, I do think that Branded Despia is still on a tier 2 basis. Hasn't changed that much. Hasn't really changed at all, to be honest. But the second copy of Gold Sarcophagus within the month was kind of cool. Gains more consistency with bringing out a copy of Branded Fusion. So it was pretty good though. And we got the recent ban list for the end of the month wherein we'll get the second copy of Branded Opening. Regardless, the Branded Espia deck is still a pretty good tier 2 deck, and it can even go up against a Tenpai strategy. So that is Branded Despia for you. Next up, we have Goblin Bikers. Now, Goblin Bikers is not complete. They are a pretty good rogue deck though. I had a ton of fun with this deck, especially when you pair it with Gold Pride, Punks, or even the typical Zodiacs. I think Zodiacs are much more nicer with this deck because it gains more advantage to the field. I think the worst one was with the Gold Pride. Regardless, I do think they still lack two more supports that would make this deck better. But so far, they're pretty much rogue, or just an okay deck per se. Next up, we have Labyrinth. I'm gonna put Labyrinth on the tier 2 status. Labyrinth was one of the few decks that actually countered Tenpai on its release, or was the go-to deck to go up against Tenpai when it was released in the Macedol. And it was one of the few decks that can easily access a copy of Dimensional Barrier, which stops Tenpais into Synchro Summoning during that turn. Then we have Tier Elements. I say Tier Elements is still going to be on tier 2. Now, the removal of Pellerino was kind of significant, lessening the consistency with the deck, but as what I've known so far by last month, people are playing this on a 60 card pile, which is one of the best versions for tier elements. And if you add Horse into the mix, it gains more advantage for you in milling a ton of cards to the graveyard. And even without the Pillarino, it's still manageable, and it is still a really good tier 2 deck per se. Then we have Super Heavy Samurai. I would say Super Heavy is still practically rogue, I would say, but there are some better versions where you're gonna play this one with Sword Soul. Then we have Centurions. I do think Centurions are pretty good as well, even though it's kind of like lackluster having to have one copy of a Centurion monster in the field as your end board, but it's typically not. Some of the more interactions happens during your opponent's turn, which allows them to gain more advantage. Sky Strikers are pretty good, but not to an extent, but they're better than Goblin Bikers or Super Heavy Samurais. The thing about this deck is this is played widely with Go Second as a strategy. It usually has a ton of board breakers and a ton of advantage that gains them a snowball effect in putting more spell cards into the graveyard. Yubel is still or primarily the best deck in Macedol, as I've thought this through, and thank you for Huno for even giving me the insight to this as well. Yubel can make a really strong end board against a Tenpai deck, or any deck for that matter, and it is still pretty strong. The two copies of the Spirits was kind of significant. It was a slight nerf, but it is still very playable with Yubel. Furthermore, the second copy of Phantom of Yubel doesn't really hurt the deck too much. Nevertheless, it is practically a tier 1 deck at the moment. Kashtiras. Now, Kashtiras, I would say the best way to play Kashtiras is with a stun variant, and I think trap decks at the moment for Kashtiras, for Horse Stun, and even where's the other one? Runic Stuns are one of the best decks nowadays that can play up against the meta, since majority of the time people will allow you or to force you to go first. Stun decks really shine out if they are forced to go first, so I'm gonna put these three here as tier 3. Then Tenpai. So majority of you already wanted Tenpai to be on tier 1, but for me it's practically tier 2. It is kind of significant with the number of Sangan summoning that you have in Macedol. You won't depend too much with board breakers because some of the meta decks nowadays can instantly stop board breakers. The dependability on the field spell alone is their strength or their core part of this deck. If you don't have the field spell, basically you are bound to lose that game. And if you don't have the second summoning, you can't go over or attack over a 3k body on the field, which is pretty hard for a Tenpai deck. Then we have Voice's Voice. I do think Voice's Voice are kind of good. It's still very practical. You can summon your ritual monster to the field. You can pop a couple of cards depending on the number of ritual monsters that you have. Even so, the targeted protection and one Omni Negate is quite enough. And the best part about the Voice's Voice is you can add a ton of hand traps or a ton of staple cards to your deck that can help you out within the game. Now, Unchained, I was supposed to place this one as Rogue, but as one of my subscribers said, it is a really good tier 3 deck. Per se, it can interact well, it interacts well with regards to board breakers if ever they are popped, and I do agree with that. Furthermore, they can have a copy of the DDD monster in the field, which is Monster Negates, a pretty good card. Second of all, they can have a copy of the Blue Dog on the field, which allows them to sync off into an IP Masquerina or any monsters for that matter that are dark. It really depends on the player who uses Unchained. Sword Soul are practically playable. It fell from grace, same as Exo Sisters. It was one of the, or these two decks were one of the best decks before, but after a while, because of power creeping, this actually fell off the tier list or even from Rogue. Striking Snake Eyes still pretty good. The 2 copies of Kirin wasn't that significant though. It's still very playable, are still very scary to go up against. Furthermore, with the Snake Eyes, even though Poplar was on 1 copy, you still have Black Witch on 3 copies, which is easy enough to access a copy of your Sinful Spoil cards from your deck to the field. Gold Pride, practically playable. I really thought that this would be good once Goblin Bikers came along, but nah, I was really wrong about this deck. Salamangreat's pretty good rogue deck. I do think that there are some instances where in a battle of attrition, Salamangreats would actually take the cake. In regards to end board, can't even like do properly with this deck if ever you are trying to set up a board. Then we have Vanquish Soul. I do think Vanquish Soul is way better than the rest of them in the rogue scene, mainly because their ability to tag monsters on the field is pretty stupid and pretty insane. And furthermore, they have protection for any cards that pop cards on the field, especially if you have the trap card available for you. This might be a really good card against, or a really good deck against Tenpai, in a sense if they are trying to board wipe, but majority of the time, it's easy enough to counter because in the format nowadays, hand traps are a lot. Next one is Ice Barriers. I'm gonna put Ice Barriers, I think, between these two here. If they're uninterrupted and they establish a really good board, they have, or they can summon a copy of the monster or an Ice Barrier monster that can stop you from ever using spell or traps. Also, they have the continuous spell that allows them to be protected for any effects. Vanadium, I would say it's way better than these two here. I think way better than Ice Barrier and Super Heavy. Ceiling's too high, but end board is great. Imperm and Maxi is one of the biggest flaws against this deck. Then we have Endymions. I do think that Endymions are pretty good nowadays. I think way better, especially if they're going to be forced to go first. At least that is one of the strengths for Endymion. And as long as you have the Jackal on the field and the Magical Masters on the field, and if you have unlimited spell counters on each of the cards, you can negate every card that was activated or that is activated from your opponent. Furthermore, against a Tenpai deck that always uses a spell card first, this actually helps quite a lot. The better Pendulum decks nowadays is Endymion and then Pendulum Magicians. I think Pendulum Magicians is right around here, I guess. Trap Tricks, still playable. And although they have pretty good protection against board breakers, but not like the other decks on Rogue. Endbird's not that great, only interacts too much with monsters, but not into spell cards. Infernoids, the new Infernoid supports were kind of good though. If you have one of the new spell cards, you can gain a ton of advantage from just that one card alone. The only problem with this deck, it runs mostly with 60 card piles, and if ever they can't dump cards to the graveyard, they can lose instantly. Then we have Ritual Beast, practically tier 2, really good deck. Has a couple of variants that uses Colossus, Protoss, and if ever you don't have one of those, they can also have the typical board wherein they can summon Appaloosa, the Link 3, and the trap card that can pop unlimited number of cards depending on the number of ritual monsters or ritual beast monsters that you have on the field, which is pretty scary for the deck. And also it banishes one card on your opponent's side. And this is one of the decks that uses Shifter to its advantage. And then we have Tri Brigade, still playable. I think it's a little bit better. No, it's still, you know, I'm gonna put Gold Pride as the last one, then Tri Brigade, and then Trap Tricks. Snake Eyes, gonna put this one on tier 2. I was supposed to put this one on tier 3, but although it is, to be honest, but you know, like I said earlier with regards to Fire King Snake Eyes, as long as you have Black Witch still accessible for you on 3 copies, it is still a strong deck. It might not be a popular, but it's still a pretty good card to have on the field. Then we have Infernoid and Mikanko, practically a tier 3 deck. Still very strong. Not many people actually know this combo or know how to pilot these two decks. Isolde on 3 copies is pretty stupid, one of the broken cards, and if you pair it with Mikanko, these 2 decks alone should not even exist. I would advise you to encounter one of this and tell me if I'm wrong if I'm not gonna put them on tier 3. Rescue Ace, tier 3, I think a little bit better than Centurions though. Then Resonators, I do think Resonators nowadays are pretty good. I think between Centurions and Unchained, they are pretty good. Loanderies, please stop playing this, it's dead, especially in the format nowadays. Heroes, I would say I'm gonna put this one on Rogue. Still pretty good though, but still the same. Maybe after the 31st ban list, this might change because we'll have the 3rd copy of Fusion Destiny, 3rd copy of Malicious, and then 3rd copy of Mass Change. Although I didn't or haven't seen people play the 3rd copy of Mass Change, but Fusion Destiny and the 3rd Malicious is kind of good. Math Mech pretty good as a tier 2 deck. Their arsenal is still on tack or intact. The 1 copy of the Diameter wasn't that crazy of a hit. As long as Circular isn't touched, this is still a pretty strong deck. Chimeras, I would say, still basically Rogue. There are some tendencies where you can go up against Tenpais on a better game. It takes knowledge to pilot this deck as well. Scareclaw, practically Rogue. Then we have Purelease. I do think that Purelease are okay for a deck, but in a format where hand traps is very prominent, I don't think so. Naturia is still pretty good for a deck, but not to an extent. It's still playable. Then we have Dinomorpheus. I do think Dinomorpheus are kind of a good deck per se, but really depends on the deck that you're going up against. It is a pretty good trap deck though, but not to an extent that it is on par with Labyrinth and one of the stun decks. If your opponent doesn't have the correct board breaker to go up against you, you can win against a Tenpai deck. But if they do, then it's typically game over. The ability of Dinomorpheus to lower their life points to an extent might be very dangerous. Rikas, I do think Rikas are kind of a skillful deck, or it needs to have a skillful player to use this deck. Sprites, practically Rogue, but a little bit better now. Hopefully by next month, or the end of this month, we'll get the 3rd copy of Starter, which makes this a little bit more consistent. But for now, they're practically Rogue. Then we have Punks, still pretty good for a deck, but not to an extent. I do think the Gold Pride with the Punks are kind of fun to play, but it's just basically a 1 Maxi, a well-timed Veiler, or an Imperm can easily stop the deck. Nevertheless, that is our tier list for the month, guys. What are your thoughts on the tier list? Tell me your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll see you guys on the next video. Keep safe, good luck. If you like this kind of content, like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.